Let's get that going here. Now, Jim better get here because I've got a whole lesson for him today. Jim, if you're watching and you're not here, man, I have stories for you. 2 cups of coffee. Okay. So I've been to North Carolina this week to the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship of North Carolina meeting, and yeah, you found her. Great. Come in. So the CBF North Carolina is the largest by far of all the state groups affiliated with the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. They're like a planet unto themselves. They had 500 people at their annual meeting. We couldn't get 100 people in CBF Texas together in a room, I don't think. Fascinating meeting, got to see a lot of people. But one of the most interesting things that happened is they had a panel, one of the workout, there's 2, breakout workshop. I combined them into one word. Yeah, it's a workout session. One of the breakout sessions was on LGBTQ inclusion in the church. And y'all, this was very controversial. They scheduled it, they canceled it, and then they rescheduled it because people kept protesting. But they had 10 pastors of Baptist churches in North Carolina that have been through or currently in the process of evaluating inclusion. All right, it's all right. 10. I do not think I could find 4 in the state of Texas. And yet in North Carolina, they had 10. And it was a really fascinating conversation. Well, at the end of the session, which was moderated by Emily Hull McGee, who's been here before, she's pastor at First on Fifth Church in Winston-Salem. It's the old historic First Baptist Church of Winston-Salem. And I went up to tell her how excellent I thought things were, and she said, "Oh, I have a story to tell you." In their own process, she used my book as one of their resources, which just this part's important for me to say. The title of the book is "Why Churches Need to Talk About Sexuality." And so she said she had the book at home, laying on the desk or counter, maybe in the living room. She was reading the book. And her maybe 10-year-old son looked at the book and came up to her and said, "What is this word? Sexuality." And she said, "I just want you to know you're the reason I had this sex talk with my son." That sparked the whole thing. Like, okay, something good came out of this. You never know, right? It was a good session, and there are a lot of like-minded people there, and that was really good. What I wanted to tell Jim is I was telling a couple of y'all beforehand, I've got a new bit of candy I can't put down, and that is, for those of you who know Dallas history and Baptist history here, O.S. Hawkins, who some of you know, has written a new biography of W.A. Criswell. And it's coming out April 1st, but I've got an advanced press copy that I cannot put down. It is riveting. Not because I agree with everything, it's just like, pulling back the curtain and seeing stuff. And great stories. You're going to hear me talk about some of these later. We don't have time today on that, but I wanted to, Jim grew up at First Baptist with Criswell, and wanted to get off into all that as well. So those are my 2 stories of the week. But today's lesson is even better than that. Because last week we started this discussion on covenant as one of the great themes of the Bible. And there were a few leftover handouts from last week. I don't know if they're still out there or not. We made it through several of these, but y'all stopped me. Well, and Carol Ann's not here, and I'm going to answer her question too. Y'all are going to have to watch the video of this.
I'm checking on her.
Okay. Excuse me. I've worked on this week. I've been interviewing people, asking, because if you recall, the two questions that stumped me last week were, number one, from Carol Ann, why did God command the Israelites males to be circumcised? And some of y'all said you don't want to talk about that, but we're gonna. And not at length. Okay. The second question that Jim asked was, okay, it looks like in the Genesis text that God has made a covenant not only with Abraham, but also with Ishmael. And his question was, how is it you have God making covenants that result in two different religions? And I sort of stammered. See, I'm combining words today. Stumbled and stammered at the same time last week and made up an answer that wasn't sufficient, as we do. But today, I've come loaded with facts. And it's been a really interesting week of exploring these two things. So, and all of that leads to the last of the 5 covenants we were going to talk about, which is the new covenant. Because when we get to the book of Galatians, in the New Testament, it is the Apostle Paul, for good or for ill, who brings this around and uses Hagar and Ishmael as an example in not necessarily a flattering way. So let's back up. I want to take the easiest question first and then get into the more difficult question. And actually, the circumcision question is the easier of the two. But my iPad fell, so let me grab it. I'm going to quote from a rabbi, because this is a Jewish tradition, not a Christian tradition. Let me get to the right place here. Oh, here we go. I'm drawing on an article from the Jewish Theological Seminary that was published actually some years ago. But, I don't think the history of circumcision has changed that much, probably.
Pretty tiny field.
Well, now, okay. What is interesting is that apart from the Jewish tradition related to circumcision, the United States historically has been an outlier in the world in the practice of circumcision in modern times. That is slowly changing. In the 50s and 60s, babies born in the United States, the chance of them being circumcised was like 70 to 85%. Which is not true, say, in Europe and other parts of the world. Now, this was driven in part by religious conviction because of our hyper-Christianity, which is related to Judaism. And so we practice some parts of the covenant, but not all of them. You remember, it's selective. But it was also driven by medical science, that you can find an argument either direction on this, the pros and cons of that. There are clinical reasons some people suggest this. And so one of the explanations that gets given most often for why God commands Moses to do this as part of the covenant is that, well, God knew what was best for their hygiene. They're living out in the desert, and this, this is more hygienic, right? So this is a medical argument in modernity that gets applied backward onto the ancient times, which this is not the only argument we do retroactively. We're going to get some other of those in a moment as well. So that's the way it happens. In reality, part of this requires an understanding, and as our Jewish scholar explains, this was not a brand new idea. This was already being practiced by some people in the ancient world for other reasons. The bigger question that we get to on the covenant is, why would, if we believe God created humanity, right, and created us as we are, why would God give us an extra part he wants us to cut off? Right? I mean, that seems like crazy. Unless your view of God sort of, goes along with that. So that's one track that some people go on. But the bigger thread from the Jewish perspective is that this becomes a blood covenant. It becomes a blood covenant. And this is about cutting and bleeding. And that, I think, gives a different perspective to it, right? It is, I always, now remember Mr. Crow in the 5th grade Sunday school class I told you about last week, the 5th grade boys class where we're looking at the floor for the entire session, squirming in our seats. I got so tickled with myself, I lost my train of thought. Blood covenant. I don't know what I was going to say. It was really important. Mr. Crow, 5th grade, embarrassed boys. It'll come back to me in a minute. Okay. Wait, here's what it was. I was always taught that this was a unique thing to Jews. That this was like the first time it ever happened, which is not true. Also, here's the funny part. This is what I was going to say. We were taught that it was sort of an outward sign of your, because people were, there's that crazy story about Noah being naked. But anyhow, people were naked around each other more in those days. And I think we also imported that into the Roman world. So here's how we get all of our biblical history and world history, and we throw it into one big pot and we shake it up like a salad and think it's going to all make sense. Because my understanding as a child in that 5th grade Sunday school class and beyond was, you had the Roman baths and all these things, and this was either an embarrassment or an obvious sign that you were different than the world. Right? That's a nice thing to tell 5th grade boys in Oklahoma City. So the reality, according to our Jewish scholar, though, is that this becomes a symbol beyond fertility. Okay, so in the ancient world, you have all these fertility rites. God has promised Abraham that he will make him the father of a great nation. And for some in the Jewish tradition, the circumcision, this makes no sense medically. A circumcised man is not more fertile than an uncircumcised man. But it becomes a symbol of fertility along with this blood covenant. Now, what's interesting is in the Torah, they are instructed to circumcise an infant boy on the 8th day. Specifically and this is still practiced to this day. And here's what our Jewish scholar says. The significance of the 8th day is illuminated by a singular prohibition in Leviticus. When an ox or a sheep or a goat is born, it shall stay 7 days with its mother, and from the 8th day on, it shall be acceptable as an offering by fire to the Lord. This has to do with the age, not an age of accountability, Baptists, but with the age of acceptability as a sacrificial offering. Yeah. Circumcision is delayed to the 8th day as if to say the very first time when the male child may symbolically be dedicated to the service of God. The rite is a pledge of fealty and the mark, a lifelong external sign of apartness. Till the 8th day, the child is without its own identity, entirely in the domain of its mother. The partnership with God is not forged until the first faint signs of viability and independence. The bestowal of a name at the same time underscores the transition to individuality and responsibility. Therefore, male Jews spend the rest of their lives moving from faith to faith, turning the covenant in the flesh into a testimonial of spiritual nobility. The Torah has thus transformed circumcision into a resonant symbol of Jewish destiny, a divine promise of national fertility coupled with a human commitment to live by God's law. The challenge of our egalitarian age is to shape a worthy initiation rite for our newborn daughters, he says. This was written in 1994. Now, obviously, in some African countries, we have female genital mutilation, which is described to be the equivalent to circumcision, but is not. And it's actually a very controversial practice. This is a complicated subject. But if we go back and ask the question that Carol Ann asked, why did God do this? You know, did God give men a foreskin just to cut it off? You know, the answer is not necessarily, right? Yes.
From a purely secular perspective, could the foreskin not be just another one of those evolutionary things like your appendix that we just didn't lose?
So, I mean, this would take a biologist, a medical biologist to answer, but I believe that could be true. You know, this is an evolutionary thing, but it also is not evolved off. I mean, boys today are still born with foreskins. You know, it's not like the remaining, you know, tail bone kind of thing.
When you mentioned the term blood covenant,
Yeah.
I was reminded of the fact that in the prison system, if a person wants to join a prison gang, he has to be willing to shed somebody's blood. Doesn't necessarily have to kill them, but he does have to shed their blood. And if he himself decides he wants to leave the gang, his blood's going to be shed.
Excellent point.
How that connects to anything, I don't know.
Well, no, it does connect. I mean, yeah. I mean, have you watched West Side Story? I mean, you know, the Crips and the Bloods, right? Yeah, Melvin.
Isn't there, and I can't remember, I thought maybe it was Sarah before Sarah did this, but it might have been, somebody early on in the Hebrew Bible that, like, cuts a foreskin. And
Oh, that's Abraham.
is it?
Yes.
Is that the story?
Who's like
I
90.
couldn't remember where, and then the woman though says this is a blood.
It's in fulfillment of this.
Yeah.
Yes, it's all.
Isn't that like the first one, sort of?
Well, yeah, he's the one who got the word, and
My understanding, don't Muslims
yes,
do it, and they did in Egypt as well?
Yes,
I don't know
right.
because they-
which is a great segue. This is a great segue to the next question. How does Islam relate through Ishmael to Judaism and Christianity? And I'm gonna jump ahead from that very great question and tell you part of the answer in advance, and then I'm going to back up and explain. And honestly, y'all, I've been to seminary. I've been writing theological stuff for 40 years. I've never dealt with this question before. I've never dug into this before. And I started asking my friend. I have a friend who's a professor of world religions who's retired. And I texted him to ask for his help on this. And he said, I'm afraid I can't help you. You need to talk to an Old Testament scholar. So I talked to an Old Testament scholar friend who also couldn't really answer the question, because it is the answer transcends our normal study of the Bible, but there's more in the Bible about this than we understand. And one of the, I hope, shocking things I want to get to today out of this is that we, through our Christian lens, overlook parts of the Old Testament story that help answer this question. We've read them all along, but we did not stop to ask about them. That's where we're going to be on this. So to get to this answer, one of the things we learn from the biblical story is, well, let me just rehash here, make sure we're on the same page. Abraham and Sarah are old, like old as dirt old, in biblical age, whatever that means. You know, sorry, I'm going to make light of this. There's this long-standing debate. Are Old Testament ages like dog years? They're like on some other scale, you know? Or are these real years? When you say Abraham is 99, do you really mean 99 as we understand it? And anyhow, there's all sorts of explanations for this. We're not going to get into that today. The point is they're very, very old. Sarah is, well, not only barren, but is past the childbearing age, right? Another whole interesting thread is to think about how often barrenness plays in the biblical story, over and over and over again. So Sarah has had no child. God has promised to make Abraham the father of a great and mighty nation, and there's no way that's going to happen, right? So Sarah has the idea, I'm just summarizing Genesis for you right now. Sarah has the idea that Abraham ought to impregnate her handmaid, whose name is Hagar. So Hagar is, depending upon how you read the text, either a slave or a servant. Somehow she's of inferior status to them. And in the ancient culture, up through, by the way, Thomas Jefferson, this is something that would happen, right? You could, the male could father children through other women. But Sarah is the one who devised this scheme. Now remember, Abraham and Sarah have already lied all along their way about who they are, and that's a whole nother, read my book for that one. I have a whole chapter on that. Not the sex book, the other one. So out of that union, Ishmael is born. And in my mind, I thought Abraham gives birth to, they give birth to Isaac. Sorry, I have to get my biblical characters in line. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Isaac comes along, but the way, if you read the biblical text, Ishmael has to be at least 13 years old when Isaac is born. Maybe more. Which gives us some problems with some of the text that we're going to highlight in a moment. And I want to go to, let's start with your sheet, because that's where this all started. It was back here in Genesis 17, which is on the front page of your sheet. Okay, here we go. Let's start in verse 17. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Can Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight. God said, "No, but your wife Sarah shall bear you a son, and you shall name him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will bless him and make him fruitful and exceedingly numerous. He shall be the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this season next year." So there is a promise made to Ishmael, right? That he will become the father of 12 princes. All right, think about this. How many tribes of Judah are there? 12? Is this coincidental? No. The whole thing sort of goes together. What we seem to be seeing here is God, by one perspective, setting up dueling family lines, right? But here's the thing that I think is most interesting about this. When we read the biblical text, even though Ishmael and Hagar at one point have gone out, they've been sent away because once Isaac is born, Sarah gets jealous and says, "Send them away." Except they end up coming back because God tells them to go back. Now, Allison has she has a lesson she's taught a bunch of places on Hagar. And I've actually got her notes here. What did I do with them? They're on the floor. Okay. This was our dinner conversation last night. Hagar is an interesting person in this because she's a slave who's named in the biblical text. This does not often happen. She's also the first person in Scripture to whom a divine messenger visits. This is before Abram's had the 3 strangers visit him. She is she's the first person in the Bible to name the deity, to give God a name. And she's the first woman to hear an annunciation, and the only woman in the Bible to receive a divine promise of descendants. And she is the first woman in the Bible to weep for her dying child. Isn't that interesting? Hagar becomes a very important figure in the biblical text. Some years ago, an author named Phyllis Trible wrote a book called Texts of Terror. Texts of Terror. And it's about passages in the Bible that we don't want to deal with because they're so awful. And there's a whole chapter in there on Hagar because she's sent away with Ishmael. They're about to die in the wilderness, and God commands her to go back to Sarah's house and be part of that. Now, here's another interesting thing. The Bible, our Jewish Christian Bible tells this story one way. The Quran tells this story another way. They're similar and yet different. What I'd like to do is fast forward here in the Old Testament to okay, there's the birth of Isaac. Okay, chapter 21, verse 8. This is talking about Isaac now. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." This is like Dynasty, you know? Y'all are old enough to remember Dynasty, right? Okay. The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. There's an interesting line. What is it that Mary says at the wedding at Cana of Galilee to the servants about Jesus? Whatever he says to you, do it. It's the very same line right here. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, do not let me look upon the death of the child. As she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him. Now keep in mind, he's got to be at least 13 here. She's not going to hoist him up above her head. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Now I want to read you how the Quran tells this story.
Do we know who wrote the Quran?
Well, so that's a great question. Basically, it was compiled by Muhammad, but not exclusively, right? It is a collection of teachings, right? The thing I need to say, and I know I'm sort of weaving in and out of the lanes here on this. Modern day Islam claims a direct lineage from Ishmael through Muhammad, and Ishmael is the founder of their religion. This is very difficult to prove, and it's very controversial. Because as difficult as it is to understand biblical history, understanding Quranic history is even more difficult, because Muhammad did not appear and have his vision until about 610. That is 600 years after Jesus. And what Muhammad does is he creates a religio-political movement that unites the disparate and warring tribes of the Middle East. What religion had those tribes practice before Muhammad came on the scene? Some of them were Jewish. Some of them practiced Judaism. Many of them practiced different forms of paganism. And Muhammad's thing was that he found a way to unite them under this idea of monotheism. So Islam is called one of the three great monotheistic religions of the world, right? That is really the defining factor of this. But a lot of Islam comes out of Judaism. And you've had hundreds of years, hundreds and thousands of years. If you ask, when did Abraham live? Depends on whether you're talking to a young earth creationist or someone else. From the time of Abraham to the time of Jesus is thousands of years, not hundreds of years. A long span of time, right? And then you have another 600 years from Jesus to Muhammad. But what happens with Muhammad and then subsequently with others behind him, is they backfill the story. They backfill the story to make the link that wants to be made. Now, that is not to say that the story is not true. It is to say there is very little contemporary documentation of any of this because it was the ancient world. And even as we struggle to understand Genesis, that clearly is written well after the fact and is answering questions that people later would be asking, right? It is not a travelogue written as a diary, right? This is Moses with his iPad taking notes every night. That's not what Genesis is. And the Quran and the traditions that develop around the Quran also face that problem and more within this. Okay, here it is. This is the way the Quran tells the story. The Quran says that it is Abraham established the covenant, and it's a year later that Ishmael's half-brother Isaac is born to Abraham by his first wife Sarah when she's 90 years old. That references Genesis. On the day of feasting during which Abraham celebrated the weaning of, this is a summary, this is not direct, the weaning of Isaac, Ishmael was mocking or playing with, depending on your translation, Isaac. And Sarah asked Abraham to expel Ishmael and his mother, saying, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." The story is the same here. Her demand was painful for Abraham, who loved Ishmael. Abraham agreed only after God told him that in Isaac your seed shall be called, and that God would make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, Ishmael, since he was a descendant of Abraham. At the age of 14, Ishmael was freed along with his mother. The Lord's covenant made clear Ishmael was not to inherit Abraham's house and that Isaac would be the seed of the covenant. Take your son, your only son, go to the land, and all that. And we know that story. And this is that's the Jewish story. I've got to get to the Islamic story here. Oh, there's that. Okay. Oh, here we go. Okay, this is good. In Islamic belief, Abraham prayed to God for a son, and God heard his prayer. Muslim exegesis states that Sarah asked Abraham to marry her Egyptian handmaiden, Hagar, because she herself was barren. Bore Ishmael, we know that, okay? According to the Islamic version, God then instructed Abraham to take Hagar and Ishmael to the desert and leave them there. He did so, taking to the location of the Kaaba's foundations, which now was in ruins. As he turned away from Hagar and started to walk away, she called out to him and asked, "Why are you leaving us here?" To which Abraham didn't reply the first 2 times she asked. She then changed her question and asked, "Did God command you to do this?" To which Abraham stopped, turned around, looked back, and replied, "Yes." She responded, "Then God will provide for us." Do you see how Hagar's becoming more of a hero of this story? Abraham then continued on his journey back to Sarah. In the desert, here we go. It already says he's 14. The baby Ishmael cried with thirst. Which is it? Right? His mother placed him in the shade of a bush and went on a frantic search for water, which resulted in her running 7 times between the Safa and Marwa hills, trying to find a source of water or a passing caravan she could trade with. Hagar, not finding any sources of water and fearing the death of her baby, sat down and cried, asking for God's help. God sent Gabriel to her, informing her to lift up her baby, and when she did, she noticed that his feet had scratched the ground, allowing a spring of water to bubble up to the surface. Hagar quickly shifted the ground to form a well around the spring to contain the water, forming the Zamzam well. Hagar refilled the bottle with water and gave her baby a drink, and this spring became known to caravans that traveled through Arabia, and Hagar negotiated deals with them for supplies in exchange for the water. From her actions, the city of Mecca grew. and attracted settlers who stayed and provided protection for her and Ishmael, as well as being sources of various goods brought in exchange with visiting caravans. To commemorate the blessing of the Zamzam well God gave to Hagar and Ishmael, Muslims today still run between the Safa and Marwa hills, retracing Hagar's steps during the rites of the Hajj. I never knew this story, right? Now, the next part of this, according to both the Genesis and the Quran, is that Abraham and Ishmael are not estranged for the rest of their lives. According to the Quran, Abraham returned and visited Ishmael at various times throughout his life. And there's two stories in this that I'm not going to read in detail, where Ishmael has married a woman that Abraham doesn't like the first time, and Abraham leaves a message for Ishmael who's out doing something, and the wife explains the message from this strange visitor, and the message means you to divorce this woman, and he does. And then he marries another woman whom Abraham approves of. And there are other traditions that arise out of this. Back to the Old Testament. Here is the next two things that are important. According to the Genesis account, when Abraham is called upon by God to sacrifice his child, it is who? Isaac. According to the Quran, the same story happens, but it's Ishmael. Okay? Sarah dies in Genesis chapter 23. And this is Genesis. Sarah lived 127 years. This was the length of Sarah's life. And Sarah died at Hebron in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Now remember, he's 10 years older than her, according to what we've been told, right? Abraham rose up from beside his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a stranger and alien here, give me land and all that, right? And they bury her there in this place. Bury, Mamre. After this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave in the field of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And then right after that, Isaac tries to marry Rebekah, and all that business goes on. That's a whole long story. And then chapter 25 of Genesis. Here's another story you probably never paid attention to. Abraham, who's got to be, 110 plus at this point, Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Now, I'm having trouble believing some of this, right? According to some Islamic tradition, not all, Keturah is another name for Hagar. Right? There is a stream of thought that teaches that eventually Abraham, in his old age, marries Hagar, who bears him other sons. Now, I don't know that that's even a mainstream position, but it is something out there. Also in chapter 25, we get this line. This is the length of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Here's the money line. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite. His sons buried him. Ishmael is there. Ishmael and Isaac are together at this point. In all my years of reading the Bible, I've probably read it, I just didn't comprehend this verse. It's right there.
Yeah.
So if there is enmity between the two, it is not noted here. They are of different ages. They're in the same region, and clearly they've been having Thanksgiving dinner together. At least occasionally, right? They are not, wherever Ishmael is, he comes home to bury his father. So, and I know I'm getting close on time. How do we get from there to Islam versus Christianity or Islam versus Judaism? Yes.
And Carrie and William and King Charles. Charles kicks off, they're both going to be there, but they're still.
Yeah, so we're told. Yeah. Yeah, unless one of them is like in frozen somewhere. I don't know. You know, but this all has a mystery to me, the royal family right now. It takes hundreds of years for this story to develop in the way we think we know it today. So to say from reading Genesis that God creates two religions out of two half-brothers is a vast oversimplification. What happens with Islam can be linked probably genetically back to Ishmael, but there is not a paper trail to get us there. And just as there are different ways to interpret the Old Testament, there are different ways, even among Islamic scholars, to interpret Islamic literature. But the truth is, we have a lot more Jewish literature than we do Islamic literature from those early times. And so Muhammad really is the beginning point of this story. And one of the most interesting questions I read in my study this week asked this question: did Muhammad intend to create a world religion? Scholars are divided on this question. Some say, well, clearly he did. Others say there's no way he could have understood it because his goal was to unite the people of a certain region and to stop their warring and to bring them together to worship not multiple gods, but one God. Now, he did this with ecstatic visions, but these visions, as he understood them, were not anti-Semitic in the way we think Islam is today. The origins of Islam are very different than the iteration of Islam that we know today, just as the variations of Islam that are practiced are very different. What's interesting is within Islam you have at least 3 or 4, maybe more different sects, probably more, that range in their severity and harshness. But the same thing is true in Judaism. You have Orthodox Jews who believe everything in the Mosaic Covenant is still true to this day. And you've got conservative Jews who were only conservative compared to the Reformed Jews. And most of the people we know, like our Temple Emmanuel friends, they're Reformed, right? So they're, like us, they're considered the liberals of their group. But both of them have these parallels. And Ishmael has 12 sons. Jacob has 12 sons. Really interesting stuff. I'm not going to jump to any big conclusions on this, but the main answer to this is to say that when we ask the question, that was a great question, how out of this covenant do we get two world religions? It is not an easy answer, and it's not a straight line. And a lot of it is fill in the blank to sort of get from here to there. It's like constructing a full-scale dinosaur with 20% of the bones.
But then what just struck me is what's going on between all that is Christianity has developed.
Oh, right.
And so then you've got the Islamic world moving west, and then you get the Crusades and the conquest and all that stuff, and Jerusalem But that's a Christian thing.
Yeah, and by the way, the relations between Muslims and Jews didn't really get bad until the Crusades. When we were in Spain and Portugal 4 years ago last week, there's a lot of places there where these two religions overlap, and we got to visit the I think it's called the Temple Mosque, the Cathedral Mosque, where like three of these religions came together in one space. They shared a worship space over time. And a lot of this played out in Spain and Portugal, by the way.
Yeah, I always understood that in Spain and Portugal, people lived in some kind of symbiosis. I don't know if
Yeah, no, that's true, they did.
But then Muslims were kicked out. No, Jews were kicked out.
Right. Yeah, there some othering happened, and, they were going to make Spain great again, I guess. And, this is a tale as old as time, y'all. Finding someone to blame for your woes. And that's how some of this comes to be. What I wanted to get to, but we'll have to save for next week, is how this applies then to the new covenant. But that will be this is going to be even more appropriate because as we get close to Holy Week, is that next week? Okay. Well, we'll be off by a week because this has to do with Maundy Thursday as well, the new covenant that Jesus gives. Thanks for listening to this. I feel like I gave a lecture today, and we didn't have much of a conversation like we normally do as well. I want to say welcome to my friend Tori, who's here visiting today, and let's pray together, and then we're glad to have Charlene back, who's going to come and take our prayer concerns. God, open our minds to understand your work in the world. We admit that we do not understand, we do not know all that we want to know or should know, and we pray that your Spirit would lead us into all truth through Jesus Christ. Amen.